All right, well, thank you everybody for joining me here today. My name is Sean Moore, and I work in Learning and Development in our San Jose office in Building 5 with Brian McPherson. And we've been asked by the corporate compensation team to put together a training based around the soft skills needed for your performance conversations that you will be engaging in over the course of the focal process. And so some of the things that we're going to touch upon today are the ideas of how to create an awareness and how to use these conversations as you approach them in terms of increasing the performance on your team, or how to use these conversations in addressing decreasing performance on your team, as well as internalizing some of the steps needed to be taken in preparation for conversations such as these. So by the end of the day, we want to leave you with some tips, some tricks, and some best practices in really how to utilize this opportunity as more of a chance to talk about performance expectations and looking forward in a more progressive conversation that's future-oriented rather than looking back over the course of the last year. Now, before we go on, there are some dates that I want to go ahead and cover. And as a reminder from the compensation team that all communication needs to be done prior to the dates that you see below, because after those dates, all the information will be populated in Workday. So for those of us in North America, the month we need to remember is June, with the 19th and 26th being the important days. And for those of you who are on the call joining us from any one of the regions around the globe, the month that you need to be aware of is July, with the 1st and the 15th being the dates to be aware of. And of course, if you have any questions, you may go ahead and contact Jessica Castillo on the corporate compensation team, and she'll be happy to answer any of your more specific focal-oriented questions. And once again, before we get started and dive into kind of the topic of the day, I'd like to take a moment to remind those of you who joined us after the top of the hour to go ahead and ensure that your phone is on mute. I am still hearing just a little bit of feedback over the line, and I just want to ensure that we go ahead and address that. Now, during the research and building phase for this training, I had the opportunity to work in conjunction with our partners over at the Harvard Business Review. And based on some of the research, we came across the metric that around 73% or so of managers, so roughly 3 out of 4 managers, don't feel very confident in their own ability to really assign that monetary value to the work that their direct reports are producing. And over the course of this time, through a partnership with Harvard, we've realized that conversations like this make managers feel a little awkward, in that you have to work with this employee on a day in and day out basis, and depending on the overall tone of the conversation, it can make the following day, or really the rest of the day after that conversation, a little bit awkward in your interactions, especially if you don't have that really good, solid interpersonal relationship with the employee. So being very aware of that feeling can help you drive these conversations forward. In addition, these conversations have the opportunity to become emotionally driven. We're dealing with compensation here. It's something that everybody expects when they come to work. And when that becomes part of their performance as well as part of a conversation, the opportunity for emotions to become the driving factor, it does rear its head. And so being aware of the emotions within the conversation is another best practices for managers to adopt and envelop into their own practices during this point in time. And of course, they make managers feel very uncomfortable. Much like I just mentioned with the chance that emotions are going to run high, these conversations tend to really put managers in a position to explain to their employee how they value their work, providing some context or clarity, but it's only if you feel comfortable and have built those relationships with your employees. So if you don't have that solid foundation, all 3 of these elements can be a factor into the overall tone and tenor of your conversations. And once again, I'd like to remind those of you who've just joined us on the conference line to go ahead and mute our phones. There's a little bit of feedback, so we'll go ahead and pause here for a second or two to allow everybody to check to ensure that they are in fact on mute. Now, these conversations are very important. They represent a period annually in which you as the manager have the opportunity to assign some sort of metrics, specifically compensation, to an employee's work. But allows you also to provide an employee with context. So basically, it allows you, the manager, a chance to show your employee your thought process and how you determined this, and placing that compensation within context. And so within conversations such as these, you, the manager, can increase the confidence the employee has within you by walking them through a step-by-step process of how you came to your decision. And now, depending on your own comfort level with explaining that to your employee will dictate how far down you go granularly in providing them clarity and context. But it is very important over the course of these conversations that you do at least minimally provide that context. And of course, this also provides you with a great opportunity to talk about career progression and how that ties directly into compensation. But more importantly, and we'll get into this in a little bit, career progression is not always about moving upward through the organizational structure. Sometimes career progression can occur by moving laterally or horizontally, whether that's to a new project or to something that the employee is a little bit more passionate about that will help them in the long run. And so it allows you, the manager, an opportunity to really go over this sort of career progression with your employee during this time. And it'll also allow you, the manager, to identify areas that you think your employee could use in terms of development, whether that's soft skills, technical skills, or any other developmental areas that you feel would aid the employee as they progress within their career. So as you can see, these conversations represent an opportunity for you as the manager to discuss various other aspects of the employee's work, not just specifically the compensation and the increase or lack thereof during this time. And when discussing career progression, as I said before, it's not always about promotions. And so when talking to an employee about their career and how the compensation ties into it, you have a few options in terms of career progression that you can take during this conversation. One such option is to discuss with the employee about their passion within the workplace. If you have somebody who may be working with hardware, but really they've got a passion to write code or work with software, when talking about a career progression, you may suggest or may look for ways to incorporate their passion into either your team, a new project you're working on, or even allowing them to step outside of the team and work on other projects that fill that need or that role within their passion and can allow the employee to further develop and refine their skill set. And so at the end, it will benefit not only the employee, but your team, the business unit, and Cadence as a whole. So really discussing with them their passion in terms of a career progression during this time is really paramount in kind of creating that future-oriented thought process. And of course, much like I said before, the discussion can also lend itself to developmental needs as well. Now, whether that's some areas of development that you think that the employee needs or an area that the employee believes they need, wherever the conversation goes in development, it is very paramount, once again, for their future progress. And not only does this represent an opportunity to tell the employee where you believe they need development, but it also presents an opportunity for the manager to highlight areas that even the employee might not necessarily have considered a need for development in, something that you have observed over the course of the past year that you think that the employee could benefit from some increased training, a discussion, or maybe an online course, but some sort of developmental need. And so you as the manager have the opportunity to shed some light on this area as well. And of course, finally, you can offer them any suggestions that you may have in more of a mentoring capacity as well, because as the manager, you do also fit that dual role of coach and mentor. And so if there are any suggestions that you might have, these conversations represent a time to go ahead and discuss that with your employee, because you do have a set captive audience during this time. And so really use them to the fullest of their benefits. So not just specifically in compensation, but also talking about career progression, moving forward, and some expectations that you have. So that way, over the course of the next 12 months, your team will move at a much better rate. Now, those are things to consider discussing within the conversation itself. However, prior to the conversation, there are a few elements and some best practices that we'd like to leave you with, because these will make your conversations much richer. They will change the overall tone and tenor of the conversation and allow you, the manager, to really touch upon everything that you wanted to over the course of this time. And there's no better place to start than in ensuring that you have prepared yourself for these conversations. Now, whether that is sitting down and reviewing past performance appraisals, past project data or notes, or any notes that you've taken over the course of the year in regards to the employee's performance. Much like when we were all at university, we were asked to cite our sources to lend credence and credibility to what we are saying. And so in these conversations, if you have reference material, some form of notes, that will solidify and provide you with a much better foundation for the conversation moving forward with your direct report. On top of that, one of the best practices that we have come across during our research process is actually creating a small short-form agenda for the conversation, a list of the topics that you, the manager, wanted to touch on over the course of your time with the employee. Now, you have a few options here. You can use the agenda specifically for yourself to guide your own train of thought over the course of this process. But one additional best practice that we have come across is the fact that you can feel free to share your agenda with the employee in preparation for the conversation itself. This will allow the employee an opportunity to prepare themselves much like you have prepared, but also if you feel up to it, the employee can suggest additional topics to discuss. So you're creating a much more equitable dialogue at the end of the day. You, the manager, have inputted the points that you want to talk about. You have allowed the employee to add to that list to figure out discussion points that they would like. And so when it comes time to the discussion itself, nobody is surprised by the topics, and you both know the overall direction that the conversation will take, which will allow you to go on tangents or to discuss other material, but always circle back and come back to where you initially intended the conversation to go. And the final note on ensuring that you've prepared adequately, I'd also like to touch upon the idea of a virtual employee. Thanks to technology, these days, managers might have one or more employees that work remotely, whether it's in a different office or even in a different country. And as a result, really preparing for the conversation, sharing that agenda, and maybe even your notes really becomes paramount, because it allows that virtual employee to prepare for the conversation. And of course, once you enter the conversation itself, utilizing some form of video conferencing tool will also ensure a good quality conversation takes place, because you'll have the audio and visual components in addition to adequate preparation on both sides. And of course, once you've chosen the topics, you also have to choose a location. And not only a location that best suits your needs, but also a location that will make both parties comfortable over the course of the conversation. Research has shown that when managers hold these conversations within their office or in a place that they are very familiar and comfortable with, that the employee automatically feels the need to go on the defensive, meaning that the chance for this conversation to run emotionally high or emotionally negative increases because the employee has that feel that they have to be defensive during this conversation. Now, if you, the manager, select a neutral location, be that a conference room or an empty office, whether that's in the same building or on a different floor or in a different building itself, but in choosing this neutral location, both you and the employee are starting from a much more equal and level playing field. And forgive the sports analogy, but it is much harder for the visiting team to win when they come and visit at the home team stadium. And so these neutral sites really do promote more open and honest conversation. And so when you are sitting down to determine when and where you're going to hold these, please do consider holding them at a neutral site. But do remember that in terms of conversations such as these, because you are discussing compensation, you must do so behind a closed door. So do shy away from using the cafes, break rooms, or the cafeteria itself. So a neutral conference room is the best, but an empty office will also do if you can't find a conference room. In addition, make sure that you have provided this context to clarify them. And what I mean by this as a consideration prior to the conversation is really, how are you going to provide context? What data are you going to reference? What are you going to tell the employee? And so by practicing that context, or at least thinking about the context that you are going to frame the conversation in, you are more likely to engage the employee in open and honest conversation. We tend to see managers who do not think about this context using other employees or other instances within the company as clarifying information. And when we do that, that tends to start to breed animosity between people or even some negative feelings amongst team members. So really do shy away from using other employees as that contextual element. And so really, when you sit down to prepare for these conversations, there should be a note paid to the ways in which you will go about providing that context. And whether that's any of the metrics or data you've gathered or specific examples that you can recall over the course of the year, just be mindful of what you are going to say and how you're going to frame that context for the employee. And of course, one of the best practices is always to plan ahead and build in more time than you think you will need. Managers tend to use what we refer to as a hard stop during these types of conversations, meaning you have allocated whether it's a half hour, 45 minutes to an hour, but we will see managers hold these conversations, run all the way up to that time, and then simply cut off, end the conversation, and move on to either their next conversation or whatever they're doing later on in that day. And while this is mindful to everybody's time and respectful to the work that we all have to do, it does tend to be viewed a little bit more on the negative side in terms of the employee, because they feel that they are being cut off without an opportunity to really expand upon what they'd like to say. And so we really do suggest that if you are planning these conversations to run for an amount of time, really over a half hour or so, to build in some sort of time for a debrief for that conversation. One suggestion is if you usually have these conversations run for an hour, plan for 40 minutes of structured content and about 20 minutes of unstructured dialogue, which will allow the employee 20 minutes to really share their feelings for this in reaction to what you have just said, but also to input any sort of dialogue that they either forgot about and didn't add to the agenda, or that they thought of in the moment. And so it provides you with an opportunity to kind of work through the conversation itself and to come to a resolution at the end of that hour mark in a much better fashion than you would have with an abrupt hard stop. In addition, if you plan in more time than you need, and the conversation does run into that emotionally charged area, and you yourself as the manager feel confident in your abilities and you have a strong interpersonal relationship with the employee, you can then use that unstructured time to discuss and debrief their emotional state. And so you can come to a much better resolution at that point in time as well. And of course, that ties directly into planning for a reaction. Now, I know this might sound like a very big negative for these conversations, but in being very objective and realistic that is a potential, you as the manager can then plan ahead and have a game plan set aside for if this runs negative, if this becomes an argument, if I feel negative emotions creeping in, I can then go ahead and either address those emotions, I can go ahead and acknowledge the emotions, and we can circle back to the conversation 24 hours later, or whatever you game plan for. But it's all based upon planning for that reaction. And so by acknowledging the idea that this is an emotionally charged conversation, you can then go ahead and plan for anything so you yourself will not be surprised over the course of the conversation. And of course, as with anything to consider during the conversation, before the conversation, there are some do's and don'ts of these kind of pay-based conversations as well. So we're going to first start off with some of the do's. And right away, it's a simple value statement to the employee. What we don't want to see is simply a 1 or 2 line email or conversation based upon just the increase or lack thereof. In reality, what you would want to do during these situations is, on top of your dialogue about the conversation, is you want to convey to the employee how much of a value they represent either to you, the team, the business unit, or Cadence as a whole. Because this will increase the employee's confidence, it will boost their overall self-esteem within their work, and depending on the overall tone of the conversation, for example, if they are not getting an increase, but you still explain to them how much you value their work, the overall tone of the conversation may run more positive versus negative. And so by really making that clear value statement to the employee, you're setting yourself and the conversation subsequently up for success. And always make sure that you explain to the employee how you made your decision. And you don't have to explain to them in totality everything that you thought of during this process, but at least giving them some sort of clarification at what you looked at, much like we just talked about in the previous slides. You want to provide that sort of contextual element. And so by really planning out how you're going to explain to them will ensure in the conversation that you do touch upon those elements. And so by really giving that sort of contextual understanding, much like the value statement, you're setting yourself up for success. And of course, like anything else, a good rehearsal will once again set you up for a great performance. And so when you sit down to review your notes, to consider the contextual elements you're going to bring into the conversation, go ahead and say these out loud a few times. Jot them down. Figure out where within the conversation you can bring these up. Because the amount of time you place in rehearsal will dictate how well you can then articulate this during your performance or the conversation, as it were. And as you rehearse this, it'll also provide you with the opportunity to go on tangents in the conversation. We all have been in conversations or in meetings where we go off on a tangent and we can't cycle back to the overall topic because honestly, it gets lost in translation. And as the manager, if you are rehearsing what you're going to say, you're decreasing the likelihood of getting lost if you go on that tangent because you're cognizant of the overall scope and tone of your conversation. And so rehearsal, whether it's 5 or 10 minutes prior to the conversation or a day or two before, is paramount in preparation. And much like every side of a coin is heads and tails, every do has a don't. And of course, don't wait for this opportunity to talk to your employee about their compensation. This really should start to become part of a more ongoing process throughout the year in terms of talking about how their performance, how their progress is tying into compensation, and really about how your expectations of their work ties into this as well. If you only talk to your employees once a year regarding all of these elements, it's going to take 12 months really for you to see any sort of change occur. And then you're relying either on your notes or your memory to revisit that 12 months later to then debrief the changes between the two conversations. However, if you adapt a more ongoing approach and have conversations such as these with your employees, either on a quarterly, bi-quarterly, or even monthly level, the windows with which you then can gauge their change and their progression by are shortening, and so you have an opportunity to gauge their progress a lot better and a lot faster than visiting this really only at one point during the year. And so as you move forward in your career as managers, we highly suggest that you start to consider making these conversations part of your ongoing best practices, because in the long run, it will make these types of instances, performance conversations, appraisals conversations, or compensation conversations, much easier in the long run. As with anything, the more you practice, the more you engage within them, the easier, the better, and the more substantial they will become. Now, we like surprises every now and then as humans. It's just part of human nature. But one thing we don't like to be surprised about is our own compensation. And so over the course of this process, be very mindful of what you have communicated to the employee. Did you create an agenda? Have you conveyed to them the topics of that agenda or the topic of the conversation itself? Are they aware of what's going to be said when they enter into that room? Because the one thing you don't want to do is have an employee sit down in these conversations and be completely surprised by the content that you're going to discuss. Because if they are surprised and unaware of that content, the likelihood of this conversation running emotionally high and into the negative increases exponentially. And so as you move forward, being aware of what you are conveying to the employee should become another consideration in your best practices. Because the more that you convey, and of course at your own comfort level as a manager of what you want to convey, but the more you convey, the less likelihood that they are going to be surprised, and so the higher the likelihood of you having an overall more progressive and more substantial conversation increases. And so that surprise factor does play a role, not only for the employee, but also for you as the manager. Now, in terms of you as the manager, don't be surprised by an employee's reaction. You yourself might believe that you are delivering some of the best news in the world. They're getting an increase in their compensation. They're getting an increase in the allocation of stock, whatever it may be. You may think that you're conveying excellent news. However, to the employee, it might not be that way. They might have another take on it, whether in terms of their own personal understanding of it or the way it was framed to them. So by really setting yourself up for a reaction, you'll then be able to deal with it as they come in the heat of the moment. So always remember that even if you feel that you, the manager, are conveying great information, that might not be the case. And so by planning for a reaction, by not being surprised, you are providing yourself with a better foundation with which to have that conversation on. Now, as we start to move and shift focus into some of the reminders of what to do and what not to do, I just want to remind everybody that at the end of our call, we will have a short Q&A session to go ahead and tackle any questions that you do have. And so we will be kind of moving on and shifting focus into kind of the long-term reminders of the conversation. But if you have any questions or anything, we can start thinking about them now, and we'll go ahead and open the line up here in a few moments for some Q&A. Now remember, some of the things that you should avoid doing in conversations such as this is really comparing the employee's increase to any other employee within Cadence. Whether that's comparing the actual physical amount, the percentage, or whatever it is, we really do want to shy away from using another employee's increase when talking to your direct reports. This is something to plan ahead in terms of preparing for the conversation and thinking about what you are going to use for those contextual elements. And as long as you are planning ahead and understanding that you can't use or that you really shouldn't use another employee as kind of the exemplifier there, that you'll be able to be successful. But it is part of the preparation process. And so by really understanding where you are going to go as the manager in terms of that context, it will help offset the chance that you might end up divulging other information in regards to another employee on your team. And of course, when considering what else not to bring into the conversation is really comparing and contrasting two employees next to each other. On one of our previous calls, I did have a manager make note that really during this focal process and in assigning and allocating compensation to the employees, that you do have to look at your teams side by side, really to allocate the compensation from there. And that is kind of the dual hat that managers do have to wear during this process, is when you are allocating the compensation, you are going to have to compare and contrast employees against each other. However, when you sit down for your conversations, you don't necessarily have to be specific as to which employees you've compared and contrasted the direct report against. You can go ahead and explain to them what you were looking at in terms of that performance, what projects, what data, what metrics, or what notes. And so you can come at it from that aspect by giving them the key markers that you looked at rather than the specific employees that you paired them up or matched them up against. And so by being cognizant of that, you'll set yourself up for success within the conversations. And of course, much like we mentioned before, that value statement about the why they're receiving this. Why do you value their work? Why does Cadence value their work? So by explaining to the employee the why behind this, you're going to go ahead and create an increase in their own self-confidence for their work, an increase in confidence in you, their own manager, and within the company as a whole. And it's just a very simple statement about telling them why you value their work. And once again, this is one of those elements to consider during the preparation phase. Much like your contextual elements and much like the notes that you're going to review, considering that why statement or that value statement is also paramount in your preparation. And of course, speaking of those contextual elements, a failure to provide that context. A failure to provide that context will simply leave your direct report with a lot of unknown variables in the conversation. And as it is with human nature, we tend to fill in the unknowns with our own experiences, our own perceptions, or even our own negatives. Doesn't necessarily always have to be positive. And so in failing to provide the context, you're leaving the door open for your direct report to really make assumptions regarding this process. And you don't want to really allow that to breed in and amongst your team, because that has a tendency to run towards the negative when we are left facing unknown. So by really being aware of placing context around the conversation, giving them that value statement, and being aware of what you are using to provide that context will really create a more foundational conversation that you can build on in terms of looking forward. It'll allow you to progress much faster in setting either new expectations or addressing expectations as you move throughout the conversation. And of course, never place an emphasis on why the raise isn't larger. We don't want to even broach this subject really with the direct report. We should shy away from mentioning that it could have been larger if they had performed up to a certain level. It could have been larger if not for the size of the team. Whichever it is, we don't want to place an emphasis on that, because that in and of itself will start to breed those negative emotions that we do want to avoid during this whole process. And so by really considering everything that's above that on the page, it'll allow you to avoid touching upon the idea of the increase could be larger. And of course, if the employee broaches this subject with you, the manager, you as the manager can go ahead and steer the conversation in a much more positive direction as long as you have prepared adequately. And of course, at the end of the day, don't panic. These conversations, as you saw on the initial slide, are rough for just about every manager that's out there. They represent an opportunity for you to create an increased connection with your team, to really have an open dialogue in regards to their performance, your expectations of their performance, of how they operate within the team, the business unit, and the overall structure within Cadence. And so these really can be a fantastic tool for you as the manager, but only if you view them as such. So in these conversations, remember not to panic, prepare adequately, and move forward knowing that you can really use this to boost the overall performance of your team. And now, as we move towards the final few slides we have here, just a few key elements to take away and remember. Preparation, like anything else, is paramount to success. And so remember, when you are preparing for these conversations, to really ensure that you're setting yourself for success. Have you considered the context that you're going to provide? Have you considered what specifically you're going to discuss? Have you reviewed any notes? Have you amassed any data over the course of the year? Are you going to bring any notes into the conversation with you? I highly suggest that you do. Coming from an education background, I was always asking people to cite their sources to display credibility. And much like in an educational setting, bringing notes into the conversation with you will allow you to cite specific examples to provide those contextual clarifying elements to your direct report. Now, the amount of notes you bring in is up to you, whether it's one page or multiple pages, but ensure that you know what is on the page and your notes are structured in such a way that you'll be able to refer to them over the course of the conversation in a much more natural approach. And of course, utilizing your notes and preparing will help you maintain focus and stay on track. Nothing will derail the purpose of a conversation faster than not being able to refocus after a tangent. And so by ensuring that you have prepared, it will allow you to stay on track, ensure that you touch upon everything that you wanted to discuss as the manager, and allow you to move forward with a more successful conversation from there. And so by preparing adequately, by tying in your notes, this will all help you stay on track and maintain that focus. And of course, over the course of that conversation, be very cognizant of the emotions within the room. Now, for some managers, this may or may not be difficult, but you need to at least minimally be aware of the emotional state of your direct report. If you feel that the conversation is turning into an argument, or if you feel that there are just too many negative emotions within the context of the conversation, feel free as the manager to pause the conversation, address their emotions, and then you have several options available to you. If you have a strong interpersonal relationship and you feel very confident in your abilities as kind of an arbiter of emotional conversations, feel free to engage that employee and discuss their emotional state with them. But be warned that when you take this track, it is going to be difficult in working through those emotions. Tangentially, you also have the opportunity to pause the conversation, address their emotional state, and then table the conversation and start it back up again within 24 hours. By providing that employee with a 24-hour window to decompress, you're allowing their emotional state to run its course. You're allowing them to then reflect upon that emotional state and to ascertain what exactly triggered it. And then when you come back to the conversation 24 hours later, you can start it off with a brief discussion regarding that emotional state and then move on from a much different starting point. A starting point that has acknowledged their emotions, that has acknowledged what started this emotional state and what were the key factors in driving it, and also as well as how the employee went about decompressing and reflecting on those emotions. And so the overall conversation after that will be much different than if you had decided to continue on with the conversation in the first place. But as with anything, this is all up to you, the manager, and your own confidence in your own capabilities. And of course, as with anything in life, always remain positive. Much like I said before in not panicking, these are opportunities for you to really have good quality, open performance dialogues with your direct reports. And yes, it is tied to compensation. There is going to be a direct link between their work and how it is allocated and how you yourself determine that allocation. But you can use these as a chance to realign expectations with performance, really discuss with the employee how much meaningful work they are doing over the course of any given day. And when I say meaningful work, I'm of course referring to either projects that you and the team are working on or specific deliverables that you have expected of your direct reports. So something that is being meaningfully contributed to Cadence as a whole. And so by remaining positive and viewing these conversations in that framework, you can then go ahead and start from a much different platform than just specifically viewing these under the lens of this is a specific focal compensation-oriented process. And so by preparing, by bringing notes, by staying on track, and by watching out for emotions, and by remaining positive, if you tie all of these elements together, the overall tone, tenor, and directions of the conversations are going to be much different than if you had just decided to do these at an ad hoc basis as you saw fit. So as you move forward, keep all of these in mind, and remember, this is a chance for you to have an open and honest dialogue with your employees regarding their performance and your expectations as the manager. And of course, if you have any questions in regards to specific focal-oriented questions, you may go ahead and contact Jessica Castillo on the corporate compensation team, and she will be happy to answer any of those, whether it's in regards to stock allocation or the percentage increase regards to this year versus last year. Whatever it may be, you can go ahead and reach out to her. And for those of you who do have questions in regards to the soft skills or preparing for the conversations, please stay on the line. We'll go ahead and open our Q&A up here in about 1 minute. For those of you who do not have any questions, I hope that you enjoyed our training here today. Thank you for joining us on the call, and I wish you the best of luck with your focal conversations. Thank you, and have a great afternoon, evening, depending on where you are calling in from. So for those of you that do have some questions, go ahead and stay on the line. We'll go ahead and open the Q&A here shortly in a moment. But for those of you who do not have any questions, feel free to go ahead and sign off. You'll be receiving a recording of our presentation here today, along with the slide deck in your email within the next 24 to 48 hours. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day. All right, so for those of you who have remained on the line with us here, if you do have any specific questions that you would like answered at this point in time, please do go ahead and ask away. The line is open for the next 15 minutes or so. Does anybody on the line have any questions in regards to the focal process and the conversations? Alrighty then, well, fantastic. If there are no questions at this point in time, I am going to go ahead and close the conference line as well as the conference itself. But feel free, if you do have any questions in the future in regards to performance conversations or the focal training process, you can go ahead and email me, and I will get back to you with your answer. Thank you for joining us again on the call, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you. Take care.